Awesome. It's not.
Morning, Mark. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to everyone else for joining us this morning. I'm going to hand you over to Mark and we'll get started right away. Mark?
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Firstly, apologies for getting on a little late anyway. So yeah, welcome to everybody to this morning's session. So really the purpose here is to talk about safeguarding and really how safeguarding or where it's come from, how we've got to where we are, and then I think a real understanding of kind of where we're going, because safeguarding is something that has just all of a sudden been launched into the limelight, I think over, I'd say, the last 2-3 years. And in as much as we might be arguing, no, you know, we've always kind of really considered the fact that we need to make sure that kids are safe, it hasn't been given the attention that it has in the last few years. So I want to start off this morning by just unpacking why that is, and also kind of looking at why it's actually taken us a bit of time to get here. So firstly, for me, I believe that in South Africa, one of the biggest challenges that we've had forever is that our legislation, specifically our legislation in the child safeguarding space, is very, very reactive. Now, that's not bad. I mean, it is good to have strong reactive legislation. And we have some of, arguably some of the best reactive child protection legislation in the world. You know, when one starts looking at the legislation pertaining, for example, to child rape, you know, that starts at life imprisonment. So it really is strong. However, we have for too long found ourselves asking the question, what do we do with this perpetrator who we've identified as a result of evidence as the perpetrator of this child abuse? What do we do with this person, and how do we make sure that the right conviction is applied? And then also asking the question regarding the child, how do we ensure that this child, through play therapy, through psychological sessions, how do we make sure that the child deals with the trauma that has come as a result of the abuse? Now, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination implying that those aren't important questions to ask. But for me, I think where the challenge kicks in is the fact that there isn't enough questioning around how did we get to the point where the child and the perpetrator ended up together in the first place? What could we have done better to prevent the abuse happening in the first place? And for me, that is kind of the big question that we find ourselves lacking to answer as South Africans. And it's in that space where the answer to that question is our legislation. So the same legislation that is so good reactively is really, really poor on the proactive side. So a very quick law lesson. I'm going to just kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So law can be broken into 3 sections. Okay, there's the highest law of the land, which is known as the Constitution, which I think everybody knows. The second highest law of the land, or the second most important law or strength law, is the statutes or the acts, the various pieces of legislation. That would essentially be everything from the Sexual Offences Act, the Children's Act, the Child Care Act, the Domestic Violence Act, the Companies Acts, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, etc., 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 etc. And then the lowest level of law, the third level, is essentially known as customary law or common law. Now, we've heard of common law kind of being a common law husband and wife, or when we think of customary law, we very often think about how that must pertain to traditional or tribal customs of South Africa. And in as much as all of that's true, the reality is that customary law is a law that applies to a specific set of people. It doesn't apply to everybody. So an example of that, which we would use very, very regularly, would be, for example, a contract of employment. A contract of employment would apply to the employees of a specific organization. Now, no law can kind of go against a higher law. So a customary law couldn't go against a statute couldn't go against the Constitution. So as an example, if in your business there is a customary law in the forms of a contract of employment, and that contract of employment says that your staff need to work from 8 until 4, well, that would be acceptable for that to be the customary law of your organization. It would be unacceptable if your contract of employment said that everyone needs to start at 2 in the morning, work through to 10 at night, and work 7 days a week. Because the Basic Conditions of Employment Act talks about a maximum amount of time that a person can work. And so you can't have your customary law superseding a higher law. So with that point made, sorry, I'm just meeting my friend. With that point made, with that kind of understanding in place, we can then kind of go, all right, I can see how laws or rules broken down into these three different sections. Then if we take all the law again, and we kind of break it in half, and we separate the one side of what we refer to as civil law, and we separate the other side for criminal law. Sorry, before we do that, if we take all the child protection legislation, let's start at that point, and we separate it where we go, we've got reactive legislation, and we've got proactive legislation. Now, our reactive legislation, again, like I mentioned, is really good. Everything from the ability to remove a child, the powers of arrest, the amount of time you can go to jail, the sentencing you can get, etc., 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 is really good. On the proactive side, we've got a big gap in that middle piece of law, in the statutes, in the act, because South Africa just doesn't have enough proactive legislation. And what's very interesting to note is that countries with strong proactive legislation have significantly lower crimes against children. So that's kind of the first thing to look at. Then we say, okay, well, what is proactive legislation? What kind of proactive legislation would we want to have in place? And for me, I think it's answered easiest when, you know, well, I wouldn't say a friend of mine, but a long-term client of mine, a headmaster, a principal of a school, he went overseas to Australia to go and visit his son, who was working over there, and with, you know, his son's wife and child and what have you. And whilst he was there, he went to a swimming gala, which his granddaughter was swimming in, and he took out his phone to take a photo, you know, capture the picture of his granddaughter swimming in the gala, and to also, you know, maybe get a little video or whatever the case may be. And his words to me was he nearly got lynched by the parents, because the legislation over there is very clear. You can't be taking photos of children because, well, the reason is there's a whole lot of reasons behind it, but it's legislated. There's legislation saying that schools need to have designated safeguarding officers. There's legislation saying schools need to have safeguarding policy, etc., etc., etc. Now, the fact that we don't have that proactive legislation means that almost by default, we don't have those proactive structures within our organizations that engage with children. That's not to say that no organization, no school, no church, you know, no sports club have been proactive about developing that proactive policies. But the truth of it is there's no law driving it. The other challenge that I see, and again, this is not a blanket statement, but very often when we're asked to have a look at the safeguarding policies of schools and organizations, quite often what we find is that those safeguarding policies have been drafted by attorneys. And the challenge very often is that most attorneys are not child protection specialists. So what the attorney is going to do is they're going to do what their default is. They're going to rest on legislation to guide them in terms of what the policy should say. The problem is, as formerly mentioned, there's a big hole in the legislation on that side of the proactive side. The second thing is attorneys, their main game is to ensure legal compliance for their clients. Now, when a school or an organization is asking an attorney to draft policy, that policy is going to align to ensuring legal compliance for the school. And the reality is that safeguarding policy needs to be there to ensure the safeguarding of the learner, and less about the safeguarding of the school. That's not to say that you know, an attorney shouldn't look at it afterwards to ensure that it is legally compliant. But the example that I always use is that if there was a policy in the hospital in terms of something to do with an operating theatre, they would probably get a doctor to draft that policy. They wouldn't get an attorney to do it. They may ask an attorney afterwards to ensure that it is legally correct. But the reality is that policy would be drafted by someone who is a doctor. And so the same logic needs to apply in this space, is that policies need to be drafted by safeguarding specialists. Okay, so now we sit where we go, we've got all this legislation. We understand that there is a big hole on the proactive side, save, interestingly, for 3 pieces of legislation, which I'll get to in a minute. And we've got policies, if they're being drafted, they're being drafted in accordance with the legislation that's in place. So what has happened, and kind of what's brought us around the kind of around to where we are now, is that in the Constitution, which obviously being the top piece of law, there is something referred to as the duty of care. Now, duty of care historically has been applied to, or primarily applied to, professions like doctors, like attorneys, like accountants, etc., 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 where, you know, if you go into hospital and you need to have an operation and you're put under anesthetic, there is an expected duty of care that those physicians will take care of you, and they will do what needs to be done to ensure that you come out and, you know, the right operation was done, or the best was done to ensure your health. Same being applied to accountants. There's an expected duty of care that you will have your accounting compliant because you chose an accountant who's a CA to do it. And again, obviously an attorney will argue your case in your best interests. However, we're seeing more and more an expectation in duty of care around those that are expected to look after, safeguard, and educate children, which the legislation in duty of care doesn't list professions. But it is, and now starting to get focused internationally on a duty of care when it comes to looking after children. Now, an example of duty of care that I wanted to point out was last year, I think it was. I'm in Durban. Anybody? And on the radio here in Durban, East Coast Radio, I heard this article, this news interview with this attorney saying that in South Africa there is a big hole when it comes to recruitment of educators, because what can happen is if I'm at a specific school, and the reasons attorney was talking is this had played out. And so the case that had played out was that there was this educator, and there had been an allegation that he'd been inappropriate with a learner or 2 learners at a specific school. So he was called in by the headmaster or the HR or whatever it was. And in that conversation, he got very irritated. His defense was that these stupid children are just trying to defame him and kind of ruin his reputation. And so he just said, listen, I'm out of here, I've had enough, and he resigned. The school believed that they dodged a bullet in that space, so they don't have to go through the road down the road of disciplinary inquiry. What a win, this problem is gone, and off the guy went. 2-3 years later, he appears at another school as a boarding master, and in that space, there's allegations of kids from that boarding establishment who now have also made allegations of sexual assault against him. As this investigation goes forward, they start questioning what went wrong, and this attorney's kind of going, there's nothing forcing this to happen. There's nothing forcing, or there's no law forcing the first school to have done anything. And to me, I'm saying, well, yes, maybe not from a legal perspective, but from a duty of care perspective, that person, that teacher, when he left school A, the reason he resigned, and they knew that, was because this allegation had been made. So they were aware that in the water somewhere, there was somebody that was aggrieved about what this guy had done. He chose to resign, but he had a contract of employment. Now, that contract of employment, which is standard, would have said he needs to give a month's notice. When he said, I want to resign, they should have said 100% fine, we'll accept your resignation, but you need to give us the 1 month's notice. In that 1 month, they could have quite easily investigated the allegation. If there was merit in the allegation, they could have then run a disciplinary inquiry. If he was found guilty in the disciplinary inquiry, his name could have then gone onto the child protection register. If that had happened, he wouldn't have been employed at school too. If he wasn't employed at school too, those kids would never ever have experienced the sexual assault to which they made allegation. So there's not necessarily a criminal violation in that space, but unquestionably, those parents of the children at school too have a civil claim against school A based on their failure in duty of care, because there was a duty to ensure that the children were made safe. And we go, okay, well, what, Mark, hold on a second, that seems like a bit of a stretch. Well, where the stretch kicks in, and what I was saying just now, is that on the proactive side, when we look at legislation that is on the proactive side, I mentioned that there were 3 things. Number 1 is we have a sexual offenders register. Now, a sexual offenders register would be a proactive step that an employer has to take. They have to check an employee against that. So that's proactive. That should be done. The Children's Act makes provision for a child protection register, and again, the same plays out, that an employer has to check an employee against the child protection register. The third piece is in the South African Schools Act, where there is a provision made for in loco parentis. Now, most headmasters or most principals, most teachers, when you ask them, what does in loco parentis mean? They're going to tell you that basically, if a child in your care is injured or ends up sick or whatever the case may be, and the next of kin on that contact form, which could be mom or dad or whatever, when that person can't be contacted, then in loco parentis, that principle enacts, and the principle of in loco parentis says that the principal can behave on behalf of the parents in the best interest of the child. Now, that's not untrue, but the principle of in loco parentis extends much further than that. So the principle of in loco parentis essentially talks not just to the headmaster of the school, the principal of the school, but really any educator in the school and also any caregiver in the school. And what it basically says is that you will behave in the best interests of a child for their psychological and physical well-being. So you need to behave, and the standard is as an engaged parent would. So you need to behave in the best interest of a child in both their psychological and physical well-being, as an engaged parent would. Now, when we kind of go, okay, as an engaged parent, the need to ensure that that child, the one that made the initial allegation, were they telling the truth? Weren't they telling the truth? If that was your child, would you have drilled down to establish that? And then there's an understanding that this person who's a teacher, you know, he's got his B.Ed, he's gone to varsity for 4 years. There's a pretty good chance that when he leaves this school, he is going to continue in the education space. So there's very clearly a failure in duty of care. And one of the other places that we see the failure kicking in duty of care is, excuse me, one of the other places that we see this failure is that when we have schools that have almost done certain things, whether it's a part of the school tradition, whether it is, you know, part of kind of what we've always done or whatever, but they don't change these things because it's what has always happened, and there's a failure in a duty of care. So as an example, one of the things that I see, and interestingly, I've had this conversation at my child's school, because if my son goes away, if he's selected for the team to travel to Joburg or travel to Cape Town or whatever the case may be for rugby or cricket or whatever the case may be, when he gets there, he's going to go and stay with host parents. And it's probably going to be a member of the team that he has to play against from the other school and those parents. Now, one needs to be going as an engaged parent. So if you are a parent, just answer this question for yourself. Would you be okay to take your child and put your child for 2 or 3 nights with a complete stranger in another province? No. Okay, but the school will do that. And we almost kind of just get caught up in the wave of going, well, due diligence must have been done. It hasn't. Nine times out of 10, it hasn't been done. There's no checking to see who those parents are. I do know that they try and get, they try and get them staying in similar kind of environments to where they come from, but there's no due diligence done. And so it's those failures, those duty of care failures, that are now starting to find their space in the civil space, in the space where civil claims will start coming against schools because of these failures. When you start looking at little schools, we sit in a place where we go, okay, when we've got the little kids and nappies need to be changed, okay, during that time, and let's assume there's a designated time from 3 until, I don't know, let's just say from 9 until 9:30 in the morning is going to be the nappy changing time. And so at that time, some of the helpers will go into the nappy changing section, the babies will get changed or whatever the case may be. Then out of the blue, some child, dirties the nappy or whatever. And so now we need to kind of move around. We need to go and get that child sorted out. But in that time, the responsibility of that caregiver is now going to quickly go and change the nappy, but the kids then get left alone. And then something goes wrong. And we go, okay, but what were we supposed to do? Because we didn't have enough staff. Well, if we didn't have enough staff to ensure the safeguarding was in place, then we need to be making a choice on whether it's acceptable to have that level of staff or that number of staff. And it's kind of these small things where duty of care is going to kick in, because like I was saying, it needs to be as if you were an engaged parent. So with all of this in mind, how do we then go from where we are now to a place where we can fix this? Because safeguarding is an immense subject. It is absolutely massive, massive, massive. It starts on one side where we're talking about very basic policies like change room policies and sexual offenders register policies and those kind of very basic policies right in the beginning. It takes us through a whole change in culture within the school environment. So we need to look at how we change and how we roll out and what change management looks like. And then in understanding that even once we have all of these processes in place, and in as much as statistics tell us that the reality is that the possibility of something going wrong is significantly mitigated when we have these proactive structures in place, it can still go wrong. And then when it does go wrong, the other side of safeguarding is going, what is in place to make sure that it's dealt with correctly? Do we have the necessary disciplinary codes? Do we have the necessary, are we connected to the Department of Social Welfare in our area? Are we connected? Do we know who the social welfare policeman is at the local police station? Are we equipped to help the child when the child makes the disclosure? Are we going to get the disclosure correct in terms of gathering that information? What are our legal obligations? So we sit with these two sides of the seesaw, one being, are we equipped with how to react if, God forbid, something goes wrong? And the other side of it being possibly more important, what have we put in place to mitigate the possibility of things going wrong on our watch? And so that's kind of the whole context of safeguarding. If we can sum it up very quickly, is proactive and the reactive. Now, what we've done and what we're doing as the Guardian in terms of our responsibility to schools and what we're doing with our clients is we have developed and we're implementing something that we refer to as the principle of the 4 and 6. Now, just to give that context, sport in South Africa and sport all around the world has really got a big focus at the moment on safeguarding. And to the point that by the time we start getting closer and closer to 2030, countries are not going to be able to compete on the international stage unless they get their sport safeguarding correct. As the Guardian, and certainly as me, for example, I was very fortunate, very blessed to be part of setting up what international sports safeguarding would look like and assist in kind of growing and developing that. And so coming back, we've developed something very similar from the sport that can be applied within the school space. And the easiest way to understand that is something called the 4 and 6. Now, the 4 and 6 is the foundation onto which organizations can build their safeguarding structures. Once the 4 and 6 is in place, that doesn't mean that safeguarding is now done and dusted, the box can be ticked, because safeguarding, different from safety, so the difference, which I probably should have mentioned a little earlier, but safety is ensuring that the environment that the child comes into can't place the child at risk. So safety is your occupational health and safety stuff. Have you got a fire hydrant? Has that thing been checked? You know, at the expiry date, has it been serviced? Have you got lights in a stairwell if the lights go out? You know, all of those processes, your occupational health and safety stuff. Safeguarding is the mitigation of the risk that comes as a result of people engaging with children, because if they're going to engage with children, there's always the possibility that that relationship can go toxic. So the 4 and 6 is to increase the safeguarding structures of an organization. The 4 is the 4 things that every organization should put in place from an administrative perspective. Make sure that these 4 things are in place, the organization has done it. The 6 is the 6 things that every staff member within your organization needs to do. And it's not just staff members, it's staff, it's volunteers, service providers, etc., etc., etc. We want to ensure that all of them have done the 6, and that every organization has done the 4. So what is the 4? Well, the first is policy. Every organization must have safeguarding policy. And that safeguarding policy needs to incorporate all the challenges or identify all the potential challenges within your organization. So that needs to deal with everything from changing of nappies. What is the toilet policy? Have you got a change room? What is the change room policy? That need to have a sexual offenders register policy and a child protection register policy. What is the policy if a parent arrives drunk at the school to fetch a child? What is the policy when we go on an excursion? What is the policy when we go on a tour? All of these policies need to be in place. We need to be able to, it needs to become almost a management tool, which we can go, this is the policy. If this happens, this is what you're expected to do. And so that is very, very important. It's the rules of engagement in the safeguarding space. Then the second part of the 4 is a DSO, or a designated safeguarding officer. Every organization that may come in contact with children should have identified, trained, and empowered a designated safeguarding officer. That is the person in the organization responsible for ensuring that the policy is being adhered to. Ensure that those change room policies or whatever are all being adhered to. And when I say that person needs to be identified, trained, and empowered, all 3 of those are equally important. So firstly, the identification of who that person should be. I always suggest in an organization that if you're going to identify a safeguarding officer, that safeguarding officer or that designated safeguarding officer has 2 attributes. The first is, I strongly suggest that you find someone who is not conflict adverse. So somebody who's prepared to kind of get done what needs to get done. If they need to call someone out, they're going to do that. They're not going to be worried about conflict. They're not going to get challenged. That, you know, somebody who's kind of very rules driven. And then my second suggestion is, if the organization is a fairly big organization, if you've got, you know, 7, 8, 10, 15, 20 people in the organization, then my suggestion would be to choose someone who is a little more mature, very simply because, we've had schools where you've got teachers that have been educators for 20, 30 years, and now someone who's 23 is just out of varsity, and they've been appointed as the designated safeguarding officer. And so older people just tend to not take instruction that well from younger people. So my suggestion would be somebody that's mature and someone who's not conflict adverse. I would also suggest someone who can apply their mind a little bit, because when we look at safeguarding is not an action. It's not something that we can do today, like get the fire hydrant right. It's a process. Safeguarding needs to happen slowly, every single day, all the time, every week. There needs to be a plan. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? Because it's about changing the culture of the organization. And so sometimes that designated safeguarding officer, when ensuring the rules are being adhered to, sometimes they would need to use the carrot, and sometimes they would need to use the stick. And so a person who can kind of, get their head around the fact that there is a bigger picture than someone using their cell phone in the change room today. The bigger picture is we want to create the culture. So maybe just have that conversation with Mark today and go, how's it, Mark? Listen, there's a new policy. We can't use cell phones. I'm not having a go at you for using it today, but just be aware that that is what the policy is, as opposed to right out of the back coming with the stick. So there's that consideration when choosing your designated safeguarding officer. Then the third is anonymous reporting. Obviously, this is dependent on the age of the learners, but anonymous reporting is important because we want to be able to give learners, educators, parents, everybody engaged with the school, the ability to report anonymously if they are aware of a challenge but feel they can't for whatever reason. Sometimes the reason they can't is because it is a child who's genuinely scared of the perpetrator and kind of feels that if they report anonymously, something will be done and it won't look like it came from them. Other situations we see is when I go to my best friend and I tell my best friend about this horrible secret that I've got. My best friend is now sitting with this. My friend wants to help me, but doesn't want to violate friendship trust. And so that anonymous reporting app finds its space in that place really, really well. And then the fourth of the 4 and 6 is communication, which is arguably the most important of the 4. In the days gone by, schools would draft these policies that would be put in its expensive leave arch file on the top shelf in the secretary's office. And in all honesty, that can't be the way we handle. We need to communicate. We need to be saying to schools, we need to be saying to educators, we need to be saying to parents, we need to be saying to everybody, these are the rules. Whether that means we put up posters in the school, maybe, if your policy is no photography on the school grounds or on the campus or whatever, then that needs to be put up on, I don't know, a PVC board at the front entrance of the school. If you want to let learners and parents know how they can download the anonymous reporting app, that needs to be communicated. Who is the designated safeguarding officer, how to access the designated safeguarding officer. So all of these elements of communication and so many more, but it is very, very important. We've even got like standard letters that we send home to parents going, from this day, this and this is going to be happening because the school wants to align itself to best international practice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that communication strategy is extremely important. So the 4, to recap: policy, designated safeguarding officer, anonymous reporting, and communication strategy. Once those 4 things are in place, then we would kind of almost go that the school is sitting with a strong platform to start building their safeguarding structures. The 6, however, is just as important, and the 6 applies to all the educators, all the admin staff, all the volunteers, anybody that's engaged with the kids needs to do these 6 things. So the first 3 of the 6 is clearances. So they need to be cleared against the sex offenders register, they need to be cleared against the child protection register, and they need to have a criminal check done. Those 3 checks must be done on any person that's going to engage with with children within the school environment. And interestingly, the criminal check, which strangely enough seems to be, schools that want to kind of just do the absolute basics will do the criminal check, and almost with the understanding or the belief that doing the criminal check, if a person's name is going to be on the sex offenders register or child protection register, then obviously they're going to have a criminal record. So if I just check the criminal record, I have all the boxes ticked. And what's interesting about that is, firstly, your name could be on any one of those registers and not on the other two. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the Sexual Offences Act talks about the Sexual Offenders Register. The Children's Act deals with the Child Protection Register. And in those two pieces of legislation, there is an obligation on the employer to do the checks. Nowhere is there an obligation on the employer to do a criminal check, other than the fact that you need one to get your SACE certificate. But other than getting a SACE certificate with your criminal check, the obligation is not, there's no obligation to do the criminal check. So it's important that those three are done. The fourth is we want to ensure that everybody signs a declaration of good standing, otherwise known as their DOGS. And the reason that we want them to sign a declaration of good standing is, in as much as we've done those three checks, if their name isn't on any of those three registers, that just tells me that they've never been caught. It doesn't tell me that they've never done anything wrong. And so we want to make sure that they weren't asked to leave somewhere before under any suspicious circumstances. There's no skeletons in the closet from behind them that we need to be aware of. And so we want them to sign that declaration of good standing. The fifth is the code of ethics, the ethical standard to which we expect you to hold yourself when you are going to be somebody that engages with learners in our school. An extreme example that I always use is kind of, when you speak to teachers and the teachers are talking to the kids, or the teachers are talking in front of parents, or in front of learners, and they're saying things like, you need to behave appropriately. When you behave inappropriately, that kind of behavior can follow you for the rest of your life. There's social media, and they're saying what we need them to say as employees. But then next thing, on Facebook, we're seeing the person, dancing on the pub on Saturday night, with, I don't know, shirt off or whatever, screaming, give me another tequila, or whatever the case may be, being ridiculous. But I think it's important that we understand that our school and the reputation, the safeguarding reputation of the school, can be tarnished by educators and can be tarnished by volunteers. And so we want to ensure that our safeguarding strategy, the whole strategy, is protected. And so we do need a code of ethics to be signed. And that code of ethics needs to be more significant than, be nice to people of all races and all genders and all sexes and all religions and all protected demographics. It needs to drill down into what our ethical standard is. So that's the code of ethics. And then the final of the six is what we refer to as the SAC, or Safeguarding Awareness Certificate. It's a very basic online certificate that educators need to do. And it just gives them a broad strokes understanding. It gives them a broad strokes understanding of what safeguarding is. And it's different from the designated safeguarding officer exam, because, and the easiest way for me to explain it would be, if your safeguarding policy was the Road Traffic Act, your designated safeguarding officer would be the policeman that have to police it. And the SAC, or Safeguarding Awareness Certificate, would basically be like the driver's license. Everybody needs to have a very broad strokes understanding of what safeguarding is. The designated safeguarding officer needs to know how to police that policy, and then you need to have the policy in place. So that's kind of the three in terms of policy, DSO, and SAC. The 4 and 6, to recap: policy, designated safeguarding officer, anonymous reporting, communication strategy. The 6, sex offenders register, child protection register, crim check, declaration of good standing, code of ethics, and SAC, or Safeguarding Awareness Certificates. Then, at that point, when the 4 and 6 are in place, it's at that point that the school or the organization can genuinely start developing safeguarding culture. So that is not the box to get ticked. That is the platform onto which we can develop safeguarding, because it's in that space then we can start looking at educating learners. We can start looking at educating parents. We can start looking at doing assessments. What is the concerns of the learners about the educators? What is the concerns of the educators about the learners? What are the concerns about the learners and the educators of other educators? We can start kind of unpacking those assessments, because it's in that space where we can really start getting the feel of what's happening at grassroots, that we can now target education, we can target policy, we can ensure that we are 100% addressing the challenges that are happening at grassroots level. So as far as safeguarding goes, that's what we're bringing to the table. We've recently introduced what we're referring to as the Blue Star status, where schools can test the school to find out, is your school Blue Star status, or is your school kind of Gold Star, which is less, or Silver Star? But kind of going, this is how we can move forward in getting the school to get the 4 and 6, so that parents and educators can start making these changes. So God willing, we can start turning around the unacceptable crime rates or crime that we have in this space against children in South Africa. So yeah, that's safeguarding, I suppose, in a nutshell. I don't know if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask, anything specific to any of the 4 and 6, anything in general that I might be able to answer or help with. Tracy?
Just so everyone knows, I have also posted the link to Marc's website on the 4 and 6, if you want to read a little bit more about that. But yeah, you're welcome to just unmute yourself and ask a question if you have anything, or if you want to make a comment about a situation, or what your thoughts are around it. Please feel free to do that. Marc, we have something from Umgard there for you in the chat.
Please, could you repeat the 3 legislations? I missed one in terms of Children's Act, Sexual Offenders Register, number 2 and 3 in terms of South African Schools Act. Okay, so the rules pertaining to the Sexual Offenders Register is in the Sexual Offences Act. The rules pertaining, so if you really wanting to drill down and find out where it is, it's chapter 6 of the Sexual Offences Act. Well, it's the Sexual Offences Amendment Act. So in 2007, they looked at making a couple of changes to the Sexual Offences Act, and they made so many, it's now called the Sexual Offences Amendment Act. And one of those changes was the inclusion of the Sexual Offenders Register. Then chapter 7 in the Children's Act of 2005, the Sexual Offences Amendment Act is 2007. The Children's Act of 2005, chapter 7, deals with the rules of engagement pertaining to the Child Protection Register. That is the second one. And then the third one, you 100% right, the principle of in loco parentis is, well, so loco parentis is addressed in the South African Schools Act, but it's important to understand what that principle means. Okay. Did that answer the questions? Sorry, I don't see a name there. Montessori Association.
It's Umgard.
Okay, I hope that answers your question. Anybody else? Any else got any other questions or comments? Thank you. Any kind of what I'm really interested to kind of hear very often is an opinion, like kind of going, this makes sense, or I understand why we're getting this wrong, or I've never noticed that we were getting this wrong, or this seems like an overkill because we've never experienced anything like this before. And feedback really from any angle. kind of going, we've got to now get this right, or you know, the kids today are all softer than kids in the past, and so they really just need to toughen up, or, you know, like whatever the opinion is. I really would be valuable to get that kind of feedback from, you know, people that are educators. So if anybody kind of feels that they're prepared to share that, I'd be quite grateful. No. Alrighty, thanks. Okay, cool. So Tracy, that's it then. Hold on. What?
Shanae.
Okay. Yeah, the guardian.co.za. If you want to have a look at our website. Oh, sure. What the hell would I just do? Okay. Anyway, it's the guardian.co.za if you wanted to find any information about what we're doing, where we're doing it, how it's working. And then, guys, if you want to, you'll see also on the website, you can subscribe to our newsletter. So you can just go there, click there, put in your email address, and our newsletters that go out that go out monthly. There's very often, you know, good information in there that is important for teachers and headmasters or principals and that kind of thing to know. Okay.
And then obviously, if you guys need any checks done, clearances, you can speak to Mark, you can speak to us, we can assist with that. But yeah, we hope that you found it of value. We hope that you found it interesting. I don't know how many of you have any policies in place around safeguarding or protecting your children. But yeah, please feel free to get in contact with Mark, with us, and we'd really love to help going forward. So
Tracy, on that, which I know will be communicated to, I think, everybody in this space. But guys, one of the things we spoke about is the designated safeguarding officer, which is very important. And we are going to be running another one, maybe 2 DSO courses for the education space between now and the end of the year. So as those dates come up, you know, Tracy will definitely kind of be sharing that. So if you have got somebody within your school, or even if it is the principal, if it's yourself, that you think there would be value in getting that designated safeguarding officer course under your belt, it really is good. It meets first world standards, and it does kind of give you a much better understanding of what can be done better in the safeguarding space in schools. So yeah, really good thing to consider. Okay, there's a lot coming up over here. I can't get lost. Okay, thank you. Perfect, Sonia, thank you. Okay, everybody, thank you. If we're done, I will stick around until the end if anybody's got like a specific question or something they want to ask, or they've got something going on at their school at the moment and they want to just kind of get a little bit of guidance on. I'll stick around to the end. Otherwise, yeah, have a good day further.
Thanks so much, everyone. And yeah, we hope to chat to you again soon. Enjoy the day. Bye.
Okay, just us.
Just us.
That's
so
it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. We're going to share the recording if you don't mind.
No.